Hello and welcome to a webinar about literacy infusion. My name is Liz Rowley and I'm the EAL consultant for Southeast Cornerstone School Division. This presentation is about how to bring language instruction into each and every class, regardless of subject or grade. If you have any questions at the end, please feel free to email me at liz.rowley@cornerstonesd.ca. So here we go. So today we're going to talk about some of the terminology used in language instruction, some language learning basics for those who are not of an EAL background, and then what is language infusion. I've modified this from a program called SIOP, which is Sheltered Instruction Observation Protocol. Hopefully you can chat with other staff and see how you can use this in your classroom, and again, feel free to email or call me. Some terminology. EAL stands for English as an Additional Language, and this is anybody who does not speak English as their mother tongue, and now they are learning English. You might see the term ELL. It's used a lot in the States and stands for English Language Learner. In the States, it would be anybody who is learning English, regardless of whether the English is their first language or not. There are a number of people who only speak English but not well. They could be ELLs as well. In Canada, we tend to differentiate. EAL are those who are learning English as an additional language, meaning they know others, and ELLs are people who only speak English but not well. Then when it comes to language learning, we talk about BICS, which is conversational language, your hi, hello, a lot of your idioms, and CALP, which is academic language. This involves a higher level of grammar and terminology. And most people who go to university or college have a fairly good CALP ability, but students who struggle are usually just in the BICS level. And we'll explain this further. A man by the name of Jim Cummins studied language, and he decided that when you look at a person's ability to use language, you can look on two scales, whether it's cognitively demanding or undemanding, meaning do you know the words already or the structures already, and whether there's context. So a context embedded is a context-rich situation. You have an idea of what you're going to hear or what kind of language you're going to need due to the surroundings or the text, and context reduced means there's no cues around you. And from there, you can take anybody's language use and put it in one of the quadrants. So for example, here we've got BICS. BICS is the cognitively undemanding language. It's the language that you already speak, conversational. It doesn't matter context rich or not. It's just that you don't have to think too hard to come up with the words. Whereas CALP, you probably had to study those words. It's cognitively demanding. You might have to think twice about using that kind of language. An example of something that fits in the cognitively undemanding and context-rich quadrant is a face-to-face conversation. You already know the language you need to have a conversation, and the situation, the context gives you lots of cues. You can even see somebody's face for a hint as to whether they understand you or not. Cognitively demanding, however, and still context-rich, would be a demonstration or experiment. Again, the situation gives you lots of cues, but in this case, you need to use a higher level of language, words, grammar, in order to communicate effectively. On the other side, you have telephone conversations. The reason why they are hard is not because you don't know the language, cognitively undemanding. It's because there's no cues, context reduced. You can't see the person's face. You can't see the situation they're sitting in. So if you don't understand the words they say, you're cooked. And then the most difficult would be the context reduced and cognitively demanding. And a typical example in school is a standardized test. There are no cues and hints prior to coming across a question, and if you can't understand the language, you have no idea what's going on. So our goal as teachers, especially language teachers, is to take our students into the CALP sections or quadrants of this chart, and EAL students tend to be in the top left quadrant, the cognitively undemanding and context-rich section, and we need to move them down into the context-reduced and cognitively demanding quadrant. Some students who are English speakers only but weak may be in the top right quadrant, but they still need to learn the language skills in order to move into the bottom right quadrant. If a student can reach that bottom right, the cognitively demanding and context-reduced quadrant, they should be successful in anything they choose to do in the future. The key difference between what's generally happening in the classroom and what SIOP, or Literacy Infusion, is promoting is that in general practice, teachers use the content outcomes and indicators to decide what they're doing in each lesson and prepare accordingly. But using Literacy Infusion, we're suggesting that teachers use the content outcomes and indicators to produce language objectives for each lesson and teach according to those language objectives. The content outcome or indicator will tell you what to teach or what the student will learn, and the language objective is the how you will teach, how students will learn, and how they will demonstrate what they know through listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So the two really do work well together. Some teachers may be doing this already, but this Literacy Infusion is trying to get all teachers to focus on that and make a point of teaching language. So different components in planning. This is no different than anything you would have learned in university and training to be a teacher. Of course, your lesson prep, building background, etc. So that's not new. It's the language objectives themselves and using them in each part of planning that is perhaps different for some people. So language objective focal points. This is what you can write about when you are making your language objectives. You can create language objectives that teach content vocabulary, so science-specific or math-specific vocabulary. And generally, teachers do a pretty good job of this. General academic vocabulary, in brackets I have AWL, which stands for the Academic Word List. This is a list that was created that is cross-curricular language that students need to know in order to be successful. I have this information if anybody would like it. I have it based on the entire list with their word families, and I have it by grade. Word parts, the prefix, the root, and the suffixes that we encounter along the way. If students really learn what each of these parts mean, it helps them interpret language that they come across that they didn't originally recognize. Language skills and functions. If you want to convince somebody of something, you will use particular turns of phrase or certain sentence structures. If you want to state your opinion, for example, I think blah 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 is a very simple form or simple function, whereas in my opinion or according to the research, those are a higher level. If we can teach students different levels of language functions and skills, they will improve. Language structures and grammar. This is your basic subject, verb, object, get your verb tenses right, articles, prepositions, all that fun stuff. And language learning strategies, the different ways learners can teach or help themselves and the different ways teachers can help them along the way. So for an example, I took this content outcome and indicator from the Saskatchewan curriculum, grade 8 science, and the outcome is to analyze the characteristics of cells and compare structural and functional characteristics of plant and animal cells. And the indicator I chose was observe and identify cell structures, for example, cell wall, cell membrane, vacuoles, etc., and identify which are found in plant cells and which are found in animal cells. This sounds actually fairly language-based because it has the words observe and identify, but it's still a very general statement. And for language objectives, we want something more specific. So for example, you could write, by the end of this class, it's always good to have a very short time frame on your language objectives, students will be able to place pictures of cell structures in their appropriate cell column animal or plant. This is for students who can't produce the language on their own, and this is very elementary, not in grade but in language terms. Students will be able to correctly label the cell structures of both an animal and plant cell as illustrated in a handout. So here on the handout you may have the vocabulary needed and blanks attached to the picture, and all they have to do is put the words in the right blanks. Student will be able to create a poster illustrating and labeling the cell structures in an animal and plant cell. So this requires the student to have a lot more language ability. They're producing it either out of their own head or perhaps they're copying from a book, but still it's not given to them and just asking them to manipulate it. And finally, student will be able to state why particular cell structures are found in either an animal or plant cell using the statement, this blah is part of a blah cell because blah. This one would be more difficult. The student would have to fill in the blanks. Each of these is an example of a language objective tied to the outcome. If the student can do these, then they are also able to do the outcome. There are some rules for language objective writing. So first of all, make sure that you write the objectives in language that students can access and understand. This needs to be information for the students. So think about their ability with language and write the objective accordingly. If they don't understand the objective, they're not going to be able to achieve it. Only develop 1 or 2 language objectives per lesson. And if you're starting out, just try 1 lesson in a day. Don't try and do it for every lesson. But 1 or 2 language objectives per lesson is enough. Many teachers are trying to accomplish too much in a short time span, and this helps you focus in on just a couple of narrow points. Make those language objectives as specific as possible. The more specific, the better. Write the outcomes so they address the content of the lesson, what they're going to learn, but also addressing how they're going to achieve it, how they're going to learn it. And again, you want to use verbs like listen, speak, read, and write, so it's a language focus. Change those language objectives daily. You do not want to do the same ones over and over again. It's boring for everybody and nobody learns anything new. Review those objectives before the lesson starts and at the end of each lesson. That's standard good practice. Make ongoing reference to those language objectives throughout your lesson. They are the integral part of the lesson and students should be well aware of them. Start small. Just start 1 day, 1 class, 1 subject. Pick your most comfortable subject and go from there. Don't start with anything too big. And use those language objectives to purposefully integrate language into each lesson as you get better at it. So here's a flow chart showing how the planning could happen. You start with your outcomes and indicators, and using those you create some language objectives using the verbs like listen, speak, read, and write, or any other verbs that have similar meanings. Then using those language objectives, you look at the different needs of your students in order to produce differentiation. And in this case, you differentiate based on the language objectives, not on everything you're doing in your class, not on the outcome and indicator. Narrow the focus down to just those 1 or 2 language objectives. It should make differentiation easier for teachers because there's a narrower focus. After the lesson is over, the teacher should reflect on how things went. Were both the outcomes and the language objectives met? If not, then perhaps you just need different language objectives and the appropriate differentiation for it. If the outcomes were met, then perhaps you're ready to move on to others. You'd have to decide where you are on this chart. Speaking of differentiation, here's the last language objective from the previous slides. Student will be able to state why particular cell structures are found in either an animal or plant cell using the following statement. So if this was my language objective, and I had students who were having difficulty with language and could not use this sentence frame as it is, they couldn't just come up with the words to fill in the blank, I could break the sentence into a chart and give the students some cues by putting the words part, cell, and reason on the top, and then I could provide the vocabulary that could possibly fit in those blanks. And by lining things up, then the students know which words would go into which blank. They'd still have to understand the meaning of each of them, so they put the appropriate ones in, because you don't have a mitochondria in a plant cell. But as long as they have some cues, they might be able to complete it. If the words themselves are the problem, then perhaps pictures would help. Your gifted students, however, should be able to come up with the words on their own and without these extra cues. So, could this strategy of using language objectives help you support your students better in your class? And not just your EAL students. It could be any student who's struggling with language, just your lower achieving students. Maybe you have special needs or other students in your class. Could these language objectives help them improve their scores and success rates? I believe so. Let's talk about it. Perhaps we can start up a PLC in your school. I would be happy to come out and work with you and maybe a couple of other colleagues and see if this works for you. So please give me a call. My cell number is 461-5407. And again, my email is liz.rowley, R-O-W-L-E-Y, @cornerstonesd.ca. Thanks for your time.